Hi, my name's Andrew Dudley, and this is Earth Live, a webcast featuring interviews with people working on the front lines of conservation. Today we're joined by Chip Barber from Washington, D.C. Hi Chip, how are you doing?
Very good to be here.
Welcome to Earth. So what is it you do?
Well, I work at a place called the World Resources Institute, which is an international research and action institute on environment and development issues, the intersection of saving the environment and economic development issues. Our global headquarters in Washington, D.C., which is where I am right now, although at home. And we have offices around the world in a number of different countries, in a couple places in Europe, Brazil, China, Indonesia, a couple in Africa, and probably got 1,000 people. And we work on big issues: food, forest, water, climate, energy, future of cities, those kinds of things from a number of different perspectives. Economic analysis, policy analysis, empowering partners in civil society to take things forward, changing how business does its work in ways that are more friendly to the environment, and a range of other associated issues.
And where did this journey begin? At what age did you realise you were going to devote your career to conservation? And was it even conservation back in the day that people or you would focus on?
Well, yeah, I studied legal studies when I was an undergraduate in college. I was interested in law, but I went off traveling as a backpacker around the world through Southeast Asia and South Asia for about 10 months. And in 1978, when I got out of college, and just being in all those natural environments, spending a lot of time in the forest in Indonesia and in Thailand and parts of India, I just wanted to do something about that. I like that part of the world, and I thought these are issues I want to work on. Unfortunately, I'd already been accepted into graduate school the following year to study legal philosophy, criminal justice, and things like that in a graduate program. But I managed to sort of mold the two together and focus a lot on the politics of communities and forests in Southeast Asia, was what I did my PhD doctoral work on. And then I moved back to the United States from Indonesia, where I've been doing that. I got a job at the World Resources Institute, actually. It's my second time I've been working there. And it's my first job out of grad school. And I worked there for 11 years back in the 90s, up until 2001. And then went off and did work of a similar nature in the U.S. government for 9 years, a little bit of consulting in between, and then ended up back at WRI about 6 years ago. And so I'm the senior biodiversity advisor. So although we don't have a biodiversity program per se, all the things that we work on have huge impacts on biodiversity. If you look at how we produce our food in the world, the urban-rural linkages, climate, all these things, land use, forests, obviously. And we have an ocean program as well, so of course on the ocean side there. And so I try to be a kind of a cross-cutting person to advise our senior management on how we should engage in a lot of the policy processes around biodiversity that are going on. In particular, they ramped up a lot in the last couple of years, and the linkages between the climate change agenda on the one hand and the sort of ecosystem services and biodiversity on the other hand. My day job, which is how we first met, which is I direct a program called the Forest Legality Initiative. It focuses very specifically within our forest program on the challenge of combating illegal logging and promoting trade in legal sources of timber. So that's a bit more specialized, but that's what I did.
Thank you. And so when you look back at what you studied, did that prepare you for the road ahead? And the reason I ask that is for a young person now looking at getting into conservation, what would you recommend they study?
Well, it's interesting because, like I said, I was studying philosophy and criminal justice and constitutional law, and I was in law school as well as an academic graduate school program. And I think what stood me in good stead was the craft of analysis and technical writing that you have to do, writing hundreds of case briefs, that, the ability to size up a situation, figure out the key moving parts and boil it down to 2 pages, turned out in a lot of the work I've done, whether it be stuff for, press, and doing journalistic things like a blog, or in terms of writing briefing memos for my bosses when I was in the government, that craft of analysis and writing, although I don't really practice law. Ironically, when I got into the U.S. government, I found myself suddenly all this abstract international law things that I had studied were suddenly what I was doing on a day in, day out basis. Basically negotiating text of various kinds of agreements, trade agreements and multilateral environmental agreements. So I guess my advice would be that, it's good if you're interested in environmental issues to study environmental issues, but studying a craft as well, having something on the side, whether it be statistical analysis or remote sensing or being really good with communications, big data, or just any kind of a craft that you also bring to it is, it's really useful practically, but it's also useful in going out and looking for jobs.
Mm-hmm.
When we're hiring people, it's very rare that, like, the fact that they went to an Ivy League school or not, for instance, is a real deciding factor. It's like, oh, this person went to Harvard or Yale, so therefore we want to hire them. It's almost always something like, we really need a Spanish speaker.
Mm-hmm.
So if they don't speak Spanish, it's not going to work. And so, or we really need someone who's good with the under the hood stuff of websites, in addition to knowing the other things. Those kinds of things. And so it's and it's sort of if they went to a big name school or not, if they can do their job and they've got some specific skills. So that's often what I've seen. So find something that you like to do that's not just about if you're interested in marine conservation. That's great. Study marine biology, marine policy, but then also go out and learn how to be a really good scuba diver and how to operate boats. Or something like that. Because like if you're going for some of these jobs, they'll say, no, we need someone that knows marine biology and policy issues and everything, but they got to be able to drive a boat. They have to be a certified, safety person on the water or whatever. That's just an example, but that's something I've seen over and over again. That those things really, help out.
And so when you going back to when you graduated, so this is the late 70s, early 80s in that period, was deforestation a thing? Was it, when did climate change and the climate crisis really begin to kick in? I know you got me onto a book by Bruno Mars, or on Bruno Mars. Was that kind of the awakening when people realised that something was going wrong with forests?
Well, I read this book by a guy named Norman Myers. I remember it was one of the first books I read about this, called The Primary Source. It came out in the 80s, and it was about the tropical rainforest. It's kind of one of the first big books about why the tropical rainforests are so important and how they were getting destroyed and burned. So, in that time period, when I was kind of getting out of all my graduates, when I was in Indonesia in 1985 to 1988, there was a big focus on forests was beginning to build, because we had very rapid logging going on. 1983, you'd seen this massive fire on the island of Borneo and the Indonesian parts of Kalimantan. That was repeated again, of course, in 97, 98. There were massive fires, and now, you're sitting in the middle of this in California. That the situation is. So there was people were beginning to think about it. It was really in when these issues, and they were local issues, activists were interested in them. I think they became global political issues: climate change, the whole of the ozone layer, the problem of ozone depleting substances, biodiversity loss, land degradation and desertification. Began to be seen as global problems. Probably like the mid '80s, there was the Our Common Future book that came out in 1987, the Brundtland Report they called it, that sort of laid out the first concepts of sustainable development and was a big basis, a lot of influence on the Earth Summit in 1992 in Brazil. It was kind of one of the first really big, there was the Stockholm meeting 50 years ago, or somebody 50 years ago, in 1972. There had been a Stockholm Conference on the human environment. It was where they founded the United Nations Environment Program. They're coincidentally going to do a Stockholm Plus 50 meeting they're talking about in 2022. If we can go back to having meetings, that's something that the Swedish government and some others have been talking about with the UN. But it was really that process, and I think that there were other things going on in the world. So you had the end of the Cold War, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and suddenly in that period, around 1990, 1991, people had this idea that, well, the Cold War is gone. That's not the issues. The issues we face now are more these common global challenges, of various kinds, and the climate change being an obvious example, biodiversity loss, and that was kind of the height of that. I think was in the period of the Rio Conference and the Agenda 21 principles they put out there, the signing of these international treaties, Convention on Biodiversity, Convention on climate change. And so ever since then, it's been an effort to try and keep some of those things going. And but that was kind of my first job at World Resources Institute. A big part of it was preparing for the Earth Summit, because the chairman of our board at the time was the Secretary General of that meeting, a Canadian gentleman named Morris Strong, and who has basically pushed this thing forward and with the United Nations. And he enlisted all of us to basically work on preparing everything you need to do to have a big summit. Meetings, drafting things, and we worked on something called the Global Biodiversity Strategy that we published with the UN Environment Program and the IUCN, the World Conservation Union, in 1992, right around that time, sort of a companion piece to the convention, that was focused more on kind of the technical and policy side of things. But there was a lot of optimism and a lot of feeling that you could do things, at that time, and it's had its ups and downs since then. But that was how I basically came into it. A lot of stuff was being invented and created. You think of the post-World War II period, the Bretton Woods system, the IMF and the World Bank and NATO and all these things, which were set up and kind of defined as an architecture around security and the global financial system. And then in the early 90s, you had this kind of creation of a set of these institutions around global environment issues. You have these conventions, you have the Global Environment Facility as a funding mechanism, and some subsequent ones. And so, we're still kind of living partly in that world, but maybe we may have reached peak UN this year with some of the things going on. But that's still very much the framework, I think, that a lot of these international discussions go on. In the meantime, you've had this whole explosion more bottom-up, localized things in particular countries. You've had a lot more stay as a number of developing countries have emerged economically and politically. China, India being obvious examples, Brazil, they have brought a whole different set of perspectives to it, which is sometimes a bit more contentious than it was more of a kind of a rich guy's club, deciding what to do. So that's where it's gone, and you've had ups and downs. You have things like the Paris Agreement, the end of 2015 was a big kind of up. It was finally, China and the United States were able to see eye to eye to a certain extent, and that brought a lot of other people along, and you had a framework there. There's obviously been some downs since then, like the United States announcing its intention to withdraw from, the Paris Agreement, and other reversals, obviously, in Brazil. If you saw any of the speeches 2 days ago, there was a virtual UN Biodiversity Summit, and some very good things were said there. And the United States didn't even bother showing up. They didn't even have a third-level person to speak. Brazil showed up and kind of basted everyone else for saying, how dare you talk about the Amazon? The Amazon is ours, and things like that. But you see a lot of progressive things going on. You saw 75 countries sign this new Leaders Pledge on Nature, and that was included the whole European Union, and there were other countries not in the Union. The United Kingdom actually was a big leader in getting the thing together. You didn't see, Russia, China, India, the United States, Brazil did not sign it. But it was 75 countries. And if you go and you look at that document, it's quite progressive. My own institution basically signed on to it as a non-governmental supporter of it. And one of my colleagues in the front office and senior management sort of said, because our president wanted to sign off on it, and was asking around, he said, "Whoa, well, that's coming into a lot, isn't it? It's like, sort of there's more meat in here than I thought, and all these governments really signed off on it." And they have not doing something is one, that's a whole different thing. People sign all the time, but it's interesting because it was not a United Nations effort. This was basically led by a coalition of governments of North and South, and with the support of World Wildlife Fund and a number of others. And it's outside of the UN, but it's way stronger and more substantive than anything that's coming out of the official UN Biodiversity Summit. So, I think that things have gotten a bit more ragged or whatever. Things just don't happen in the United Nations halls anymore. Well, no one was in the halls, actually. They're just all on Zoom like we are, But, and you see more in the way of kind of self-generating coalitions. You have the New York Declaration on Forests, was a similar thing back in 2014. There was a big climate summit in New York, but across the street they had this signing of the New York Declaration by a number of governments, but also big companies like Unilever and Mars and others like that, and a lot of NGOs and everything. It was which made much more substantive commitments and got a lot more press and attention than the formal things that were going on across the hall in the United Nations. And so you're seeing a bit more of this kind of multipolar world with different stakeholders playing more of a role. A lot of that has to do with what's happening with social media and data and information out there in the world. It's much more democratized in a lot of ways, as you well know from your work. I always like to tell the story. It was in 2008, I believe it was, 2009. I was in the State Department, U.S. State Department. I was the Forest Division Chief. And our undersecretary was flying to Indonesia for an official visit and was doing some things. And the U.S. ambassador there at the time wanted to take her to Sumatra and go up in a helicopter and go over some of the areas where there had been forest fires, and there was the peat swamps that hold huge amounts of carbon. The Kampar Peninsula is a place where was a real ground zero of conflict and deforestation, and when it burns, it just releases an incredible amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So the undersecretary was going to go up there. So we were prepping for this trip, and we were going to look at some remote sensing imagery of what had been happening there over the past year. In order to even look at that stuff, I had a top secret security clearance. We had to go into a special room in the State Department. The secret part of state, the part that deals with classified maps, printed these things out, brought them in, so we could look at them with the undersecretary, and she could understand where she was going and everything, and then they took them and destroyed them somewhere. Those much better maps than that. If you fast forward, 12 years now, till now, you may have noticed that the Norwegian government paid the company Planet, who does so they do very high resolution remote sensing. You're well familiar with them. They made a deal the other day they're paying $45 million to get a lot of Planet's imagery and just make it publicly available for those who support their mission of reducing emissions from deforestation. And you can go on any number of apps that you've helped to invent a bunch of these things. And our Global Forest Watch that we manage at the World Resources Institute, Global Fishing Watch is another one that deals on the fishery side. You can get stuff on your phone free and look at it. That's way better than what was this top secret classified military grade stuff that we were looking at back in 2007. That has democratized access to information. The downside of it, I think, is that people thought if everyone could see what was going on, that things would change. And it turns out that just data and information are not enough. Take Indonesia as an example. When I first did a publication, we studied the sort of political economy of the big fires in 1997, 1998. And, 20 years later, or almost 20 years later, 2015, they were having a bunch more fires. And I went back and I looked at the recommendations that we had made back in, the aftermath of those fires in the year 2000. And almost every one of them had happened. So Indonesia was no longer an authoritarian country. It had become a democracy. They had, freed up non-governmental organizations and civil society to do whatever they wanted. Free press, elections, much more freedom of information about things like, geospatial things and everything. You go and listen, every single thing had happened, but there's still an incredible amount of corruption, and there was still an incredible amount of fires. So clearly, going from a centralized, authoritarian, closed system of, lack of information to an open democratic system with a lot of information and freedom to operate relatively wasn't going to solve the problem. It's the entrenched power of, political and economic relations and things like that. But so, I think people have gotten a bit more sophisticated about that. The truth will set you free or whatever. So we just, if we put it out there, I always say that, the NGOs who do advocacy campaigns and the kind of name and shame work, which is important, going out and exposing, bad actors doing bad things, cutting down the rainforest, for profit where they shouldn't be. Name and shame only works if those that you're aiming at have shame. And what we're seeing these days is whether on, that works sometimes, both on the corporate side and the government side, and sometimes it doesn't work. There are governments that don't have shame, and there are people on the business side who don't have shame. And so you need to begin to use a number of other tools, I think, as well. And that's why we began to focus, in large part on the sort of enforcement side and the environmental crime side. and the following the money, going after. I think a lot of people are saying, because you can knock out a poacher here and there, you can take their guns, and whatever. But if the money's still there and the demand is all still there, if you're not working on the demand side and the financial flows and the fraud and the money laundering and all that, it's going to be very difficult to actually break those chains. So I think we and a number of other organizations have begun to focus a bit more on that upstream side of things, and it's a lot easier with some of the tools we have now. Tools of financial analysis, forensic accounting, obviously ways to monitor supply chains, and things like that. That it's easier to do some of these things than it has been in the past. That's a long answer.
Okay, no, that was a fantastic answer. Thank you, Chip. And so you talk about governments acting independent of the United Nations. So the United Kingdom recently passed or is passing legislation to make it illegal for larger businesses operating in the UK to source products such as cacao, palm oil and rubber in a manner that doesn't comply with local laws to protect the natural environment and ecosystems. Do you think that's the way forward? Would you like to see that happen in more governments?
Well, I think they affect each other. That because in the end, the United Nations is only as strong as what the members or the parties to a convention are willing to bring to the table. So if that standard is set, with timber, you had the United States amended the Lacey Act in 2008, made it a crime to import illegally harvested timber. The European Union followed suit with their EU timber regulation. Australia followed suit. Korea has done something similar. There have been a number of tropical forest countries who have these bilateral deals with the European Union, these voluntary partnership agreements, where they have strengthened their systems of due diligence about logging. Indonesia, Vietnam, Ghana, there's a whole bunch of them. So the standard has risen. So now when these countries sit down and talk to each other in the United Nations, they're talking from a different platform because they don't want to do stuff that's weaker or contrary to what they're already doing at home. It's the case of the UK and the EU is interesting. It's interesting for a lot of different reasons, particularly this week. But in the European Union, they have a strong policy moving forward to develop exactly this, not just timber, but forest risk commodities, as they call them, those agricultural commodities that tend to have a lot of impact on deforestation. Soy, cattle, palm oil, cocoa. They've been doing that for a while, and they're moving forward on that. And that's got quite a bit of momentum as part of the European Green Deal. So the UK is now in a position of wanting to basically stake out its own positions that are complementary to that, but that are, post-Brexit. So this new one is interesting because the focus, it's under consultation right now. It's in a public consultation mode. I know this because we've been preparing some comments to send to them. We have an office in London who's quite close to a lot of these folks. And so we're participating in the public comment phase, which closes Monday, actually at midnight. And one of the big things is that they're focusing very much on the legality side of it, showing legal origin. So palm oil coming from somewhere, there'll need to be a showing of due diligence that it was legal. Now, in Europe, there's a bit more of a saying, well, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's sustainable. A lot of things are perfectly legal, but they're not good. So we want a higher standard than that. And, and we also want to look beyond the environment. We want to look at some of the labor, human rights kind of issues that often arise with commodities. And, in the UK at this stage, I think they've staked out that doing this legal bit is, is an important piece. They are at pains to say usually, in their policy descriptions that, we know this is only part of the puzzle. They've got the whole, this whole global resource initiative, this is sort of sitting underneath, and this effort, and the just rural transitions, which is kind of this whole effort to put together environment and development stuff, looking at some of the equity and anti-poverty aspects of things, but I think what they're saying is taking the more practical view that there's only so much the law can do, and it's only a piece of it, but we can focus, you can't legislate morality, as they say. You can legislate behavior. And a lot of people have pointed this out over the years. I don't know if it actually breaks down that well between sort of the Catholic theory of law and the Protestant theory of law. And the United States falls on that side more on what they call the Protestant side, and that, we're not going to make a legal commitment as a country to do something that we know we can't possibly do. and we think it's dumb. So when people propose something like completely halt biodiversity loss in 6 months, they say, no, we're not going to do that. It's impossible. And we don't, we're not going to commit to that and break our commitment. Whereas there's a whole other idea of law that does come out of the sort of old theology of the Catholic Church, that humans are imperfect and we always fail. And you have to set high ideals even though you know that you're not going to reach them. And there's a certain strain of that, in Europe, that we're going to set standards that are very, very high, and then we know we're probably not going to hit them, but we want to set them high versus a more practical perspective. Let's actually bite off a piece that we can shoot and actually do something. I don't know how much of that is there, but you definitely see these two approaches that are, a bit different. It's good that, this is a good problem to have, I'd say, from an environmental perspective, that you have the European Union and the UK and some other countries. In the United States, there's some bills floating around in the US Congress that would do the same thing as what the UK or the EU are doing, substantially the same. Nothing's moving right now because we're in an election year. It's pretty crazy. But there's some bipartisan support for that in the Congress, and I could see that moving next year. So it could end up being within a year or two's time. You've set a whole new standard of, some major Western countries, at least. In China, we work with China quite a bit. We have an office in Beijing. They're making a few moves in this direction. They, are quite dependent on imports of soy, for instance. Because pork is very important there, and things like that. They've made some adjustments in what they do on timber. They're a big country with a long history, and things change slowly. We've seen a lot more openness to the idea that China would join things like this, and I think as other countries come on, when they look around their own neighborhood and they see Korea doing something like this, it's like, well, Koreans are doing it. Why can't you do it? About timber. So because it'll be important, obviously, to bring China along. And so Xi Jinping made some pretty impressive speeches. Again, they're just speeches, but it's good to hear. So, China to be carbon neutral by the year 2060 was last week. This week he spoke on biodiversity at the UN and didn't make any big commitments like that, but pretty strong language on the importance of finding ways to harmonize conservation of nature with sustainable economic development, and things like that. So, it may be, it is obviously political. One stakes out a position where one can look good when one perhaps is not looking so good on some other issues going on in the world. And, it's not just China, all governments do that. You try to put your best foot forward. But all the same, it's important in China that you have that language on record that, the paramount leader, at the highest level is saying, go forth and do ecological red lines to conserve our critical ecosystems, and we need to extend that, overseas in terms of what we do. It's, that's hopeful. I mean, when you work on the diplomatic stuff, you tend to get very, I wouldn't say that your bar goes down, but you come to be happy with incremental steps. The idea of that, you aren't going to get everything you want right away. And as they say, if you get everything you want right away, you didn't ask for enough. But but if you get something, and you go home at the end of the day, or the end of the week, or the month, or whatever, and saying, they've actually moved, in the right direction. And by the same token, I think you can get pretty discouraged if you look at some of the, environmental reversals you've seen, say, in the United States or in Brazil, under their current political regimes. But there's things that are pretty solid. Now, obviously, there's been a big push against climate change by present administration in the United States, but the support for things like anti-wildlife trafficking, anti-illegal logging, nature conservation, at least in the international sphere, is very bipartisan and is supported strongly in both houses and both parties in Congress. So if you look at the amount of money that's flowing from the U.S. into these efforts, I was in the aid agency, USAID, back in 2005 to 2009, so bridging the Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration. Budgets didn't change, and they haven't changed that much for a lot of this stuff. They've even gone up in some cases, moving from the Obama administration into the Trump administration. So you have a certain certain consensus that has developed that doesn't get swayed that much by the politics of the present moment. You can go back and read documents, the Bush administration, the president's initiative against illegal logging back in 2003, 2004, and compare it to the language that was being talked as these same issues in the Obama administration and even now, and there's not much difference. It's become a kind of a settled sort of a broad consensus. And likewise in Brazil, they've obviously got a very populist reactionary government there right now, but that's not really who Brazilians are overall, or what Brazilian society is like, and they will bounce back and forth. So you can't give up because you have reversals like that. Politics is always like that. You take 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, or sometimes 2 steps backwards, and that's just the way it is. And you see other places that are doing some really great stuff, that are really moving ahead. Colombia's an impressive place. Some real problems for decades. Violence, criminality, and all the problems which they faced, and they've now come out of that as a real environmental leader. They started the whole idea of the Sustainable Development Goals was basically proposed by Colombia back in 2011, 2012. And then as things have moved on, they have become pioneers in how we reimagine cities, the sort of sustainability of how you do cities, and situate in the matrix of nature that they actually depend on. They are trying to do what they can in conservation. They're facing a lot of post-conflict pressures. Post-conflict, all the investors come in and want to, start converting land, but they seem to be, playing a strong leadership role in that part of the world. Other countries have gone up and down. Then there's always the standouts who do great, like Bhutan and Costa Rica, who always, are doing and saying the right things within their own context. So you have to try to stay optimistic in this line of work, I think, and also patient, realizing that you're always going to have reversals, and we've been through some of these things together. Something doesn't work. I mean, our Global Forest Watch platform that we have, I worked on that back when our first idea to do this was back in the 1990s. And it was a really good idea. You'd have near real-time, freely accessible monitoring stuff on the status of the world's forests. Problem was, we didn't have the right partners and the technology was not really there yet. You could do some nice national forest atlases and they were done. And the whole thing kind of almost died out in about 2001, 2002. Sat around dormant until, in the meantime, they invented Google and things like this. And Google got really interested in, Earth monitoring, and, things like that. And they got really interested in doing something on this. And you had, a lot of other things, the remote sensing stuff becoming much more available. So basically, more or less the same idea, 12, 13 years later. It's not that it was a bad idea in 1997. It just, its idea, its time hadn't come. And then when its time came, boom, it took off like a rocket. And now we have what just happened the other day with the Norwegians basically saying, we like this approach. And they aren't just making it available to us. It's going to be available to, pretty much, anyone that's doing some work like this. But, we'll buy this stuff up. And, Planet didn't even exist back then. I was just hearing today about this. So Vulcan, the big philanthropy, was founded originally by Paul Allen and partners in Microsoft. Vulcan is supporting a system for marine monitoring called Skylight. Have you heard about this? No. Skylight, it's not near real time. It's real time monitoring of vessels, and it's so accurate that it can. If you go online, they have a demo. It's so accurate that it can identify things that might be vessels that don't have the transponders, which would actually show where they are. It's so accurate, in fact, that they are apparently concerned. I heard this from someone else who heard it, that it's so accurate that if they make it generally available, the bad guys will begin to upgrade on their side. There's always a sort of technology war and find ways to go stealth. Even if they're basically maintaining radio silence and things like that. But that's a technology that 5 years ago didn't even exist. Mm-hmm. There were ways to monitor, find out where there were vessels on the surface of the ocean, but not to determine if they were engaging in fishing behavior or if they were registered or not, or things like that. So, in 5 years' time, and as you know, because you're in this business, you can't think about what the technology is today. You need to try to imagine what it's going to be in 5 years' time, and be planning your response strategies around where it's going to be, not where it is today.
Yeah.
That can be kind of hard, and it's kind of a generational thing too. I think that people get wedded to a certain way of doing things, and they have a hard time breaking loose and doing certain things.
Exactly. And can I ask you also, so when you're looking at this evolving legislation that the UK government is doing and other governments around the world, what is your advice to a CEO of a corporation that may have, sustainability issues in their supply chain? What advice would you give them?
Well, I think that you need to, and there are companies who have done this fairly effectively. You need to have leadership from the top down. So if you look at, say, Unilever, a former CEO, Paul Pullman, he took this on. He thought there was a business case for it, that, as a consumer-facing country where people were concerned about palm oil, and there were campaigns against them, about, orangutans and rainforest and, climate change, that there was a business case for doing this to reduce their risk portfolio, obviously. But he personally believes in it. And he's actually now running an interesting consulting firm he started called Imagine, which is basically advising other companies on how to make these kinds of transitions and things like that. But that's important. One, you need that kind of leadership. Everyone's got to believe the boss actually really cares about this. Mm-hmm. Two, you need to have an integration into your actual operating systems. You can't just have an add-on training about due diligence and supply chain sourcing or human rights any more than you can about racism or gender or something like this. It's got to be integrated into the mainstream of your compliance and due diligence work. Every company has compliance systems, and it's got to be seen as a mainstream part of your business, just like health and safety, just like adulteration of foods, or things like that. So that's important. And the third thing I think is you've got to the extent you can do this as a non-competitive or pre-competitive thing, make common cause with other companies. Because if one company does the right thing and it's going to cost them a little bit more, but no one else does, they're just at a competitive disadvantage. And so that's important. I guess the fourth piece is that when you're working in countries, only governments can really level the playing field. When I worked on fisheries issues years ago in Southeast Asia with illegal fishing with cyanide. People use cyanide to catch live reef fish for consumption in restaurants. It's a big thing in Hong Kong and southern China, or for aquarium fish. And I remember talking to some of the traders in Hong Kong, and the same company would be operating legally and sustainably in Australia on the Barrier Reef, catching groupers, putting them on a plane, sending them to Hong Kong. Exact same company doing terrible things in eastern Indonesia, not that far away. They're actually introducing cyanide as a way to catch fish. Cyanide's bad. It stuns fish, makes them easier to capture, but cyanide's poison. It hurts the reef, obviously. It kills reefs, but also it's in tablets in the way it's used, and people get poisoned. Kids find it and think it's candy. All sorts of bad things happen. And this one trader said to me, he said, well, in Australia, yeah, it's a great place to do business, but Australian rules. If you're in Australia, you play Australian rules. Indonesia, you play Indonesian rules. If you play Australian rules in Indonesia, you go bankrupt. So, that's up to Indonesia. If they set the rules like Australia, we'll play by those rules. You can make money, in Australia. And, that's the problem, is that one company can do, you have forestry examples of this in Indonesia. So you had Asia Pulp and Paper, a company infamously did bad things in lots of deforestation for ages and ages and ages. And, they finally began to move around for a variety of reasons into only using fast-growing plantation timber and not using, the hardwoods in the tropical rainforest. But, our argument as the U.S. government, concerned about environment and working with Indonesia on this is, I'm glad that you can sleep better at night and your consumers can sleep better at night. That doesn't save that forest. If some other company moved in and did the same thing you were doing, the forest is just as gone. I mean, we're not anything particularly against you. If you stop, that's great. We have to change the industry. We have to change the standards. So basically, you need to inform on the other companies who are still doing this. You have to rat them out, because that's our goal. Your goal is to clean up your supply chain. That's great for you. That doesn't save the forest. But in the end, the argument back, which is a fair one, is only government can actually set that. If the government is not laying those rules down, and industry has to explain that to governments, that when the government says, you need to clean up your act because we're getting in trouble around this, they have to say, well, you got to clean up your act too. You have to set the rules and enforce them fairly and impartially. And just because some company is owned by the defense minister's brother, you can't give them a pass. It has to be fair and impartial. So those are the other things, I guess. I would say in a company. It really depends on the kind of company too. A consumer-facing company, that's selling products that people can identify as, I'm not going to buy this product because it's got palm oil in it or something like that, are in a more vulnerable, and they tend to move faster. I mean, those are the ones that you see the headlines about, doing things, than someone who's behind the scenes, and is basically a trader or the financial institutions, who are bankrupting things. So they're, finding ways to increase their exposure so that they become as concerned as some of the consumer-facing companies is one of the challenges I think people face. It goes back to that follow the money kind of thing.
And for a consumer, what's their role in this? What are the concrete action steps that people like us can take?
Well, I mean, it's hard because there's only so much information that an individual consumer can be, can reasonably want to collect. It's like on, what fish species from where, sustainable to eat. Should I not eat anything with palm oil or use anything with palm oil? Or is there good palm oil and bad palm oil? Should I only get certified stuff? Who do I trust on that? It becomes, I think the main thing a consumer can do is, when there's obvious things out there, one can do it. Do your research, support, if there are certification or labeling schemes that you think seem pretty robust, then, patronize them and tell people that you patronize them. We have, everything's about influencers these days, and, on social media, I saw some really well-known influencers are apparently selling used bathwater from themselves on eBay, things like that. So, they have a lot of influence. So people like that I talked to a journalist from the Vice Media Group in the UK the other day about beauty care products in the rainforest. Because they did an article, and it's, it just came out talking about, if you're buying beauty care, stuff, soaps and lotions and things, essential oils, and you want to, have a positive environmental impact, what's the consumer to do? And it's difficult, but I think just letting it be known to companies that you care and you want more information, and you think that companies are now a much better position to supply that information because it's much more transparent. That's pretty much what you can do. And people can act as consumers. They can act as citizens too. So you can actually go out. There's lots you can do. With your app on the phone, and stuff like that. I'm going to buy this. I'm not going to buy this. But you can also go out and put your voice, in politics, basically, and say, I'm going to support those leaders who share my values and are going to do something about it. So, you can try to get the legislation passed in the U.S. Congress, that's going to do something about this and say that, there's a legal obligation to actually exercise better due diligence about what you're buying that comes from other parts of the world that might be making climate change and biodiversity loss and people's lives worse, and it could be done in another way.
So Chip, you've travelled extensively around the world. Have you ever had a moment where you've been in the natural environment and been like, wow, this is incredible, this is so worth fighting for?
Oh yeah, many. Where to start? The rainforest of Southeast Asia and, many places, Galapagos Islands, in Patagonia, down in the southern tip of South America, the American West. There's many places, as you know. Most recently, my wife and I, not connected to my work, we were volunteer citizen scientists on an archaeological expedition to the island of South Georgia, down in the Southern Ocean, off Antarctica. So we spent a month on a small boat with like 12 other people doing archaeology of the sealers who went down there in the U.S. and the U.K. in the late 18th century, early 19th century, after Captain Cook discovered the island. And we spent basically a month on South Georgia, which is a rare thing to do. People can get there on cruise ships and spend a couple of days, but we landed at 15 places. Just got this rare access in South Georgia, which anyone who's seen, it's in many documentaries. One of David Attenborough's favorite places is just unbelievable. There's 5 million penguins there, 5 million king penguins, albatross, seals, killer whales, all over the place. It's just absolutely spectacular. It's like the world before anything happened. And relatively, it's had some invasive species and things as well over the years, but still relatively sound. So that's a part of the world that just is pretty amazing. That's my most recent one.
On a professional level, has there been a high and low moment in your career that you'd like to share?
High and low moments. Yeah, there. I think high moments have been when people really came together around things. The Paris Agreement, despite all the problems in getting it implemented, that was pretty exciting to be there. I wasn't there for the whole 2 weeks, but I was there for a fair amount of it. And to see that people really felt that they were coming together and they were finding ways, and the leaders were coming to the table. It was like that back in '92 at the Earth Summit. It was the same thing. And then, there have been others, low moments, many times at like 5 a.m. in the United Nations arguing over this paragraph or that, where you just go, this is a waste of time, man. This is like, we are really fiddling while Rome burns, and, so it goes up and down. I think I get a personal joy out of seeing some of the young people I work with who have came into work either in my program or others, just sort of wide-eyed and just getting going, in their early 20s, and then 5-6 years later, they're just really accomplished and doing great stuff, and making me feel like, yeah, I can get out of this stuff pretty soon. It's it's in good hands. There's a good new generation, but we always need more people like that. We need people who are interested in giving new perspectives, because there's always a need for new ways and new perspectives.
Well, that brings me to my next question, and one of the last questions. To a young conservationist or an older person looking for a career change, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, it's like I said, cultivate a particular craft. I think that's a big part of it. Having the passion to do it, and presumably if you want to get into it, you have the passion, and cultivating a craft that you can bring to the table. Because it's something a lot of people theoretically want to do, but it's like if someone says to me, "Oh, I want to work in conservation," you say, "Oh, well, what do you want to do?" And sometimes they don't really have an answer. They just say vaguely, "No, it sounds good." The other thing I think is once this pandemic is over, getting out and working and living in some of the places that you're interested in saving. Like if you want to work on Latin America, learn Spanish, and go spend some time in Peru or Colombia and observing and meeting people and learning about it. That's as one of my professors said, I was doing a very policy-oriented doctoral dissertation in community forestry in Indonesia, and he said, go out and spend some time in at least one village. Even though you're not doing kind of village-level studies, spend some time in just at least one village, because I guarantee you, when you finish this and you start working on this stuff professionally, that will be one more village than pretty much everyone else that you'll be working will ever have been in. Which isn't completely true, but it's good advice. If you want to work on things, and particularly in the developing world, you need to really see it from the perspective of people who just have much different and often very limited choices about how they can, their time horizon and their strategy for survival and taking care of their families. If you don't understand that, it's going to be really hard to be effective.
That's so true, and I remember the trip that we went on to Madagascar, and we
Oh, yeah.
the river and went into that village and met that community. It was really life-changing for me to see.
Yeah, Madagascar is, it's definitely, even for someone that's traveled around the world a lot, Madagascar it's a whole other planet. It's, it's an incredible place, got some challenges. So.
Is there a book that you would recommend to an aspiring conservationist?
An aspiring conservationist, do I have Mike Rozelle's book here? No, it's at the office.
Oh, Tree Spiker.
Yeah, case study is, is interesting, but there's a number of books of that type, like Green Rage and things like that. I mean, I find it kind of inspiring to read about the people who were way out ahead. Anything about David Brower. What's it called? Conversations with the Arch Druid.
Hmm.
Also, the classic one is Sand County Almanac. Who wrote that? The Thinking Like a Mountain. I took all the work. I don't have it, but no, I don't go into work. Yeah,
Brilliant. We can find those links and put them at the end
yeah,
of the
yeah,
interview. Yeah,
yeah,
but that's
yeah.
great. Well, Chip, thank you so much for your time today. I know how busy you are, and it's been really appreciated to hear your story, and we really appreciate your time. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Take care.